So I want to thank you all for being here. What we're going to do today on this Super Tuesday is talk about one of the least discussed part of the presidential election campaign. Does anyone know why it's Super Tuesday? What makes it so super?
Multiple states are voting.
Multiple states are voting, and they're not voting for President of the United States, I'm sure you know, but they're voting for who the nominee for their respective party is going to be. So that's what I want to talk to you about today, the primary season and what that means in terms of our democracy, what that means in terms of how we elect a president. So thank you for coming. I just want to point out that this event is sponsored by Civic Engagement Institute. I actually have an assistant who is not here today, but she helped organize and plan for the topics. This is the first in a series of 4 events that we're doing regarding the presidential election. They're all happening this semester. The schedule is around, I think the next one is March 25th, and that one will be in Founders Hall. And I believe the topic in that one is explaining the Trump phenomenon. That would be 8 years later after his rise to political prominence in 2015, 2016. That will be followed by the actual election possibility of a Biden-Trump rematch, the way it happened in 2020. It looks like those are the two who are most likely to be nominated by their party, although you never know what can happen in today's political climate. It's entirely possible that 2 candidates who are not even foreseen are on the agenda come November, but we don't know. So there's another event happening in March. That's followed by another in April on the contest between the two, and then a 4th in early May on why and how there may be a need for a third party in this country. I think the American people are clamoring for another alternative to the Democratic and Republican parties, but we haven't seen it gain any traction for whatever reason. And it's interesting that that's the case, because if you look at polls, you see that most Americans are dissatisfied with the choices that we have, and yet no third party has emerged, no viable third party has emerged to challenge the Democratic and Republican parties. So we'll look at that in early May. Today, we're looking at the primaries on this Super Tuesday, where, as you said, a bunch of states are having elections for who their candidate on their side of the aisle will be. And so I want to, and here is Kelly. She is assisting me. Come in. Thank you for putting together the schedule and for contacting the right people, Kelly. So the primaries are a first step in how we elect a president, and that's the title of today's discussion. So what are the primaries? Well, they take place over many months from January to June in the election year. So the first contests were held in January, a few in that month, then a few in February, and that leads us to today, again, Super Tuesday. There are more states that do the primary elections in March than any other state, but they're 6 months long. So it's a long process, and I think that serves as a lesson for us in terms of what democracy actually is. Most Americans are under the misimpression that democracy is simply voting for the right candidate in November, on one day, 1 month in November. But actually, democracy is a multi-months-long endeavor. And I think Americans don't tend to understand that. Democracy requires much more of a commitment than simply voting on one day. Primaries are run state by state. And that's important to know, too, because most Americans think we have national elections. And on some level, they are national, but they're nationally done on a state-by-state basis. And the same is true of the primaries in similar fashion as it is to the actual election in November. So they're state-by-state elections. More on that in a minute. How do we determine who the primary winners are? The candidate with the most so-called delegates wins, whoever gets a majority, and we'll see what that number actually is on both sides in a few minutes, but you get delegates who are chosen after the outcome of these state elections. Each state has a different number of delegates, as we will see. That adds up, and whoever gets a majority wins their party's nomination. The candidate who gets the most delegates on both the Republican and Democratic side then gets to run for president of the United States in November. So you can see that the November elections are the final, the culminating portion of a multi-months long contest in which people are supposed to be involved and engaged and committed to the democratic process. How do primaries work? Well, I touched on this a minute ago, but they work on a state-by-state basis. And this has to do with the issue that in American government we call federalism, which means that unlike most countries of the world, we have a three-tiered system of government. There is the national level, sometimes referred to as the federal level. There are the state levels of government. All 50 states have their own rules and regulations for primaries. The local, which really has no bearing on this, but they set their own agenda for certain items too. So we have a three-tiered system. When I'm in American government, I draw a layer cake, and the three layers are representative of the three levels of government. That's what federalism is. And as far as the primaries are concerned, the states set their own rules as to how the primaries are conducted. They're not all the same. There is no federal regulation that says that primaries have to be run this way in Connecticut or in Texas or across the board. States get to make up their own mind as to how they organize it. Now, of course, when we talk about the primaries, what we are mostly speaking about are the two parties. And as I hope you all know, and I'm sure you all know, the Republican and the Democratic parties are the two that have most, if not all, of the power in our political culture. Some wish it were not so, but it is. As I said earlier, there's a very high level of dissatisfaction with the two parties. If you look at any poll taken over the last, say, 10 years, even though most of you who are registered to vote are probably Democrat or Republican, maybe a few of you independent, the fact is that you're not all that happy with how your party is doing things, according to the polls. And I think that anecdotally, we know that to be true as well. But the Democratic and Republican parties wield a lot of power when it comes to how the primaries are organized, and they wield a lot of power over our political system in general. And it makes it very difficult for outsiders to gain any traction, to gain any power. So let's say you don't like the Democratic or Republican Party, you want to be an independent, right? Well, you don't have much of a voice in a lot of these primary contests, and I'll say more about that in a minute or two. But even more than that, let's say you're so dissatisfied and you want to be politically active, but you want to start your own party. It is very, very difficult to do that on a state level, let alone a national level. And that's why there has been one or two examples of third parties gaining any traction in American history in the 240-year history of this country. You hardly hear of a third party having any success because the two-party system drowns that party out. The Republican Democratic parties, they have the most donors, the most money, the most political support. The most seasoned politicians are the ones who attach themselves to one party or the other. So for a variety of reasons, there's not much of an opportunity for those on the outside to become part of the system. I suppose on some level, as we look forward to the discussion on Donald Trump, that's part of his popularity. The impression is that he's an outsider, and he likes to let the people in power really give them a hard time. That's part of his appeal. And I think it speaks to how the Democratic and Republican parties do have a lot of power. I think also what we're seeing in this election cycle, as in most election cycles, is there is a certain unspoken, unwritten word that if you've been part of a political party for a long time and you've risen through the ranks, then you are entitled to running for election, whether it's as a senator or as a presidential candidate, that it's your turn. That's what I mean by a rite of passage. And you can see it in both parties at one point or another. I remember about 20 years ago, it was just George W. Bush's turn, 24 years ago, I guess, because Bush had earned his stripes as governor of Texas. He comes from a political family. It was just his turn. And right now, the impression is that Joe Biden, it was just his turn to run in 2020. A lot was made of Hillary Clinton, it being her turn in 2016. It turned out that the Barack Obama campaign upended that narrative. But at the same time, I think there is that within the Democratic Party, too, that it's just Joe Biden's time, and he must run for re-election in this case. And it's hard to break out of that mold. It's hard to say I'm an outsider or I am new. Maybe I'm a little unseasoned, but I can bring a lot of good ideas. Very hard to break through if you're a young up-and-coming politician at the local, state, or national level. So that's why the power of the two parties is very much a reality in American politics these days. So how do the states regulate primaries? Again, they each have their own rules, state by state, although they are basically guided by 4 different kinds of primaries. And this is something I think that's relevant for you to know regarding Connecticut, but it helps to know how it works across the country. So there are 4 types of primaries. One is called the closed primary. Right? What does that mean? It means that only people registered with a certain party can vote in that primary. So using the example of Connecticut, if you are a Democrat, you belong to the Democratic Party, you registered as a Democrat, that means you can only vote in the Democratic primary for president. You cannot cross over and vote for the Republican contest. Okay? It also means that if you are an independent, let's say you are affiliated with neither the Republican nor the Democratic Party, it means that you cannot vote in either primary, the Democratic or Republican primary. So again, closed primaries are the most closed off from the majority of the population. Then there's the open primary, which is the opposite in a lot of ways. All registered voters get to pick a candidate for whom to vote. And it doesn't matter which political party or no political party. If you belong to no political party, you can still vote in an open primary. To take part in this election, the voter does not need any political affiliation. You don't need to be registered with any particular party. You need to be registered to vote. Nobody who's not registered can vote in a primary or any election, as you might know. How many of you here, by the way, are registered to vote? Good. I think everyone raised their hand. Excellent. That's good. We all should be registered to vote because that's the first step in the democratic process. Besides the closed and open primaries, there's the partially open primary. What does that mean? It means that the system, again, the rules are set by each state. If they're partially open, they permit voters to cross party lines. So if you're a Republican, you can vote in the Democratic Party. Now, keep in mind, if you vote, you can only vote in one primary. So if you're a Republican and you cross over and vote in a Democratic primary, you can't then vote in the Republican primary in a state. But it's only partially open because their ballot choice may be regarded as a form of registration. So let's use the state of Idaho. Let's say I'm a Republican in Idaho, but I want to vote in the Democratic primary because I just hate one of those candidates and I want to vote against that person, right? In order to do that, and I vote for the Democratic Party candidate of my choice, that means I've become a Democrat. You automatically are registered from Republican to Democrat. And in order to go back to the Republican Party, you have to re-register as a Republican. Sounds complicated, kind of is, right? But that is what a partially open primary does. And then there is a partially closed primary. I know it gets really complicated, probably needlessly, but this speaks to the power of states. They get to make a lot of their own rules, independent of what the national government says. In a partially closed primary, the state permits political parties to choose whether to allow unaffiliated voters to vote and how. So it's similar to an open primary, right? But it can still exclude members of the opposing party because they get to set the rules. So there's a caveat there with closed primaries, or partially closed primaries, I should say, in terms of who gets to vote, right? So you consider those four the major ways in which states organize their primaries. I mentioned also there are two at the bottom, and this speaks mostly not to the presidential contest, but you may know that primaries also select senators and House members too. It's not just for President of the United States. So California, for example, there are a number of Democrats and one Republican running for a Senate seat in California, right? And instead of having a Democratic and a Republican primary for Senate in California, what they decided to do is the top two, regardless of party, are the winners, and they compete against each other in November for the Senate seat. Happens to be Adam Schiff. On the Democratic side, he's in the lead, but he's going against two other Democrats for the Senate seat. On the Republican side, you have Steve Garvey, who was a longtime baseball player for the Dodgers. And it looks like Garvey and Schiff may get the top two votes, which means they will square off in November for that Senate seat. So again, the top two system only applies to Congress, not the presidency. And then there are some, only a couple, like Alaska, where the top four candidates get to compete in November. And I raise that as an issue because I don't want you to just think that democracy is about voting into office a president. In some ways, members of Congress are just as important, if not more important, to your daily lives than the President of the United States, although the President gets a lot of attention, as you know, in the media. So this is a map of how the primary elections work in each of the states. You can see that it's color-coded. And there are some closed primaries. A handful of states have closed primaries. There are partially closed primaries. Connecticut is one of them, right? And there are open primaries. In fact, it seems like, I didn't do the counting, but a majority of states are open primaries. I like that way of doing things the best, just because if you really want democracy to flourish, what you'll do is give voters the widest, the largest amount of choices, right? The more choices, the better in a democracy. And the more you close things off, the more it allows the two-party system to dominate. And I'm not all that interested in that, being as fiercely independent as I am. Anyway, so you can see from the map that there's a lot of variation here across the states as to what the rules and regulations are. Now, I mentioned earlier, in order for a candidate to get their party's nomination, they have to get a majority of delegates. There are different numbers for the two parties. In the Democratic side, you need 1,968. That's a majority of delegates. And you see how that's totaled state by state. Each state gets a certain number of delegates, in much the same way that in a presidential contest, each state gets a certain number of electors. I think this may be an obvious question, but how do we determine how many delegates a state gets? Does anyone know?
By population, I guess. By population?
By population. So the more populous a state is, the more delegates. You can see on the Democratic side, in the case of California, our most populous state, although ask me again in 10 years, that may not be true, but it gets 416 delegates. That's the largest number because it's more populated, that state, than any other. Lowly Connecticut, on the other hand, gets only 49, only slightly higher than, Rhode Island and a couple of others, right? But what happens is all those delegates are totaled, and whoever gets to 1,968 wins their party's nomination, right? And it's I believe in every state, a winner-take-all proposition. So if there are two candidates between the Democratic and Republican candidate vying for the delegates, whoever wins, even if by one vote, gets all the delegates for that state. Okay. Now, on the Republican side, the numbers are different, but the concept is the same, right? You need 1,215 on the Republican side to get a majority. And each state is apportioned differently. That, too, is based on population. The numbers are just smaller here on the Republican side. But again, it's the same concept. All right, so let's get to the candidates this election cycle. How does this all work? Well, on the Democratic side, and it's kind of an unspoken rule also, that if you are president and you are running for re-election, everyone else needs to step aside and let you run again, if that's what you want. However, there have been inklings of protest against Biden, as you may know. Protests based maybe on his age, his mental acuity, maybe his policies. There are a number of reasons why there's been some opposition to Biden. I don't know that this comes as too much of a surprise, but he's been challenged, and these are his challengers. And from left to right, they are Dean Phillips of Minnesota. He's a senator there, and he also happens to be of the opinion that the Democratic Party needs a new generation of politicians who can challenge the status quo. He basically says, Biden, well, he's old news. He needs to step aside. He'd do the right thing, and he would go down as a great president if he did. So he's trying to take Biden's place in the most magnanimous way possible, but Biden is not stepping aside. So anyway, that's Dean Phillips. In the middle, you may know him. He may look familiar. He has this face that is historically familiar to people. Who is that? Does anyone know? You know.
Robert Kennedy.
Robert Kennedy, Jr., right? Robert Kennedy, Jr., the son of the senator from California, could have been President Robert Kennedy, who was assassinated in 1968. That's his son. And he had been running on the Democratic side to vie for the primaries, but he's gotten very little traction, very little support. So he's beginning to launch a kind of third party. He's trying to get signatures and run as an independent. And he's gotten signatures in Arizona and a handful of other states, so we'll see where that goes. And on the right is Marianne Williamson. She's a relatively unknown, although she's been around for quite a few years. And she's more of an independent, but identifies as a Democrat and has run on the Democratic side, has not gained traction in either 2020 or 2024. So what's happening over the last few primaries and over the last couple of months? Here's what's happening. All right. Two of them have disappeared. They've kind of dropped out. As I said, Kennedy's gone independent. Williamson has just dropped out entirely. Dean Phillips has remained, and he's gotten a few delegates here and there, but nothing to brag about, and he's not bragging about it. Biden is the presumptive nominee for the Democratic side, at least for now. What about the Republican side? Here are the candidates. In fact, I didn't have enough room on the screen to give you all the candidates that the Republicans had starting in November, December. There were a dozen of them, only slightly less than there were in 2016, 2020, about 18 or 19 of them. It seems like every 4 years, Republicans come out of the woodwork to run for president, but they drop off pretty quickly. The five I have up are from left to right. Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida. Next to him, up top, is Chris Christie, former governor of New Jersey. Vivek Ramaswamy, who is a businessman, Republican. He's kind of an up-and-coming politician, young, very articulate, very provocative in his statements, I will say. But he's gained a lot of media attention, but not any delegates. Maybe it's 2 or something, I don't know. And then on the right is Nikki Haley, former governor of South Carolina. You may know that she was chosen by Donald Trump as the UN ambassador. And finally, below them is Donald Trump. I should actually, if I was creative-minded enough, I would have put his picture much larger because he's consuming a lot of oxygen. And he's basically wiping out these candidates one by one. And they've gone. They haven't launched their own independent party. They have just conceded that they can't win the primaries. And the only person left standing against Donald Trump is Nikki Haley, who just recently won the delegates in Washington, D.C., something like 19 delegates, not very many. Problem with Nikki Haley is she's not won much else. The primaries that have happened thus far, Trump has defeated her pretty soundly, from Iowa to New Hampshire, and even, perhaps embarrassingly, in her home state of South Carolina, he won by about 20 percentage points over her. So she's not faring all that well in terms of the delegate count, although she has commanded a lot of attention. She has presented herself recently as the opposition to Trump, the anti-Trump within the Republican Party, if you will. And her comments are interesting because she said, we don't need two white old men running. They're too old. We need a new generation of talent, new generation of political leaders. That hasn't gained much traction. I have never seen anything, by the way, like Donald Trump in politics, I will tell you. That's why we are having an entire event devoted to trying to explain the Trump phenomenon. He just consumes the oxygen in the room, and his supporters just love him. And it doesn't matter much what he does. He said it a long time ago, I could kill someone on, Fifth Avenue, Times Square, and I'd still have my supporters. And you know what? I think he's right. And so he has the most delegates so far. After today, he'll have a heck of a lot more. Basically, the message for Nikki Haley is she really has no chance to surpass him in delegates. It's not going to happen within the Republican Party. There are rumors swirling that maybe she will launch an independent party movement with Dean Phillips. I doubt it, but I've heard these things. You never know. But the Republican nomination is Donald Trump's to lose. There's no doubt about it. I also wanted to put a map up of when the primary season happens. It's over a 6-month period, and this color-coded map gives you a sense of when the primaries happen in each state. You can see the kind of burnt orange color, that's March, and most of those are happening today. That does not include Connecticut, mind you. Connecticut's primary will happen in early April. What's this? April. Yes, in April, right. So if you're interested in voting, it's going to be Trump and Biden. And remember, if you're a Democrat, you can only vote in the Democratic primary in Connecticut. You can switch allegiances, but it's a partially closed primary, so there are restrictions. Keep that in mind. But I would get educated on how that all works. If you're not registered to vote, then you should register, and you should vote in the primaries. Have your voices heard, because the reason I put this map up is to send the message that democracy is a many months long process. It's not just the act of voting in one election. So the likely winners, in short, are Joseph Biden and Donald Trump. That means that Joseph Biden will be the nominee for the Democrats, and Donald Trump will be the nominee for the Republicans. However, there is a bit of a caveat there. There are rumblings within the Democratic Party that maybe Biden is too old, he's not mentally acute enough, and perhaps the party elders within the Democratic Party may get together and say, you know what, we need an alternative. The polls indicate that Biden is lagging at this moment. Now, it's too early to know for sure what will happen in November based on polls in early March. But if those continue to show that Biden is weak as a presidential candidate, then it's entirely possible the Democrats may replace him. And the place to do that is the so-called convention. Both parties have conventions in either July or August, depending on which party. And at the convention, they formally nominate the person. And maybe it will be what's called a brokered election in which they say, you know what, President Biden, it's time to step aside. Or they may just nominate him and be done with it. Those are the rumors that are swirling about, though, that perhaps there should be an alternative. Gavin Newsom, governor of California, has been mentioned as a possible alternative. And what about Trump? Well, if you haven't heard the news, he's being prosecuted, I don't know, every state, 50 states, Guam too. I don't know where he's being prosecuted. Florida, New York, Georgia. He's got a lot of activity happening in terms of committing crimes, from, promoting this idea that the election was fraudulent, conspiring to engage in insurrection on January 6th. It's involving an extramarital affair, a sexual assault case against him in New York. He tried to persuade Georgia officials to find him votes. So all of this has made the news, and there will be trials. And if there are trials and he's found guilty, can a criminal, someone who's behind bars, run for president? Maybe somehow Nikki Haley steps in his place if that should happen. I doubt that will happen. Very recently, the Supreme Court ruled that he's not going to be tried anytime soon. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but it seems like if there is a trial of Donald Trump in any of the states I mentioned, it's going to happen after the November election, in which case, if he gets incarcerated, he could actually pardon himself. That would be the first time ever. So there is a question mark as to these two candidates. They're the presumptive nominees. They're not the official nominees just yet. So what does this all mean? Well, they will face off in November, very likely. But it does pose some questions for not just the presidential election, but for democracy. What are the issues that surround them? That's what you all should know. I know it's very easy to get caught up in the personalities of all this if you're interested in politics, but what do they represent? What do they stand for? And how do these candidates fare against each other? Again, polls indicate Trump has a slight lead, especially in swing states, but that can change in a heartbeat. How much support do Biden and Trump have among the electorate? Why is it the case, for instance, that a majority of Americans are not satisfied with these two choices? That tells us something about our political culture today. And why is this such a consequential election? Every 4 years, political pundits and prognosticators, they say this is the most consequential election in our lifetime. It's a cliche, but I think this time it is. I really do. And as an historian, I have to be careful not to make the present day any more important than past years and decades. But I will tell you that this is a consequential election because of what's at stake. You can't leave, you don't know. You have to stay.
You're not locked in.
There you go. Okay. So why is it a consequential election? Well, you all remember the election 4 years ago. It nearly caused a revolt against the entire system, an insurrection, as they call it. And so I would take care to know that this election will produce very unhappy people, regardless of the outcome. How we handle it as a people is important. And I think what we must remember is that, political outcomes must be decided politically, not through violence. And that's what we've seen recently. And it seems like the temperature is being ratcheted up. And the more we can calm things down with our civility, the better off we'll all be. It's very important that we do that. So why are primaries important? Just to wrap things up, they are examples of what I call, I didn't invent it, but I like to apply it to this situation, participatory democracy. It means that we participate in democracy, not just by voting, but by engaging ourselves in the issues, by learning what's at stake, by connecting ourselves in our own world to the larger national discussion of who gets to be president. We are all part of democracy, but it's not just a one-day act. It's a daily activity that we have to engage in, like the food we eat. It's that important. And I could spend an entire semester talking to you about how important that is, but I'll just leave it at that for now, that democracy is the way we behave across the board, not just on one day. Also, the primaries give people a voice beyond one Tuesday in November. Again, if it's a multi-month long process, then you can be engaged in these issues and who the candidates are. And it also gives citizens the opportunity to engage in communal dialogue. This is not just a dialogue you have with yourself, it's a dialogue that you have with your family, with your peers, with your neighbors. That's what it should be. That's the way democracy used to work in America. And finally, there's strength in numbers. I can't tell you how many times students and others say, you know what, doesn't matter who we vote for, they're all the same. And to me, that's just a cop-out. To me, what is important is that in groups, when we organize for a common cause, whether it's voting for a political candidate or believing in environmental issues, civil rights issues, whatever it is, when we organize in groups, that's what makes us powerful. And we have the lessons of the civil rights movement and the abolitionist movement, just as two examples to prove that. That when people gather together for a common cause, that's what makes democracy work. It's not Donald Trump, it's not Joe Biden, it's not the Democratic or the Republican parties, it's us. Okay, and I'll end with that. Thank you very much. If you have any questions now, though, I'll be more than happy to answer them or comments. We still have some time. Yes, here you go. I'll pass the mic around so that everyone can hear.
How does, like, I guess, what are the rules in Connecticut for independents, like voting in the primaries?
The rules, I don't know if you heard, what are the rules in Connecticut for those who are independent? So if you're an independent, if you belong to neither the Democratic nor Republican Party in Connecticut, you have to register to vote for whatever primary you want to vote in. So let's say you want to vote for Joe Biden in the primaries in Connecticut. You have to become a Democrat.
Okay, that's what I thought. I just
Right.
But you can do that like the same day as the election now, right?
Absolutely. So it used to be that there was at least a week to 2 weeks before that you'd be actually registered to switch your affiliation. Now that's no longer the case. It's done very quickly. Now, if you want to remain an independent, what you do is you switch to the Democratic Party to vote, then you switch back to independent. That's what I've done before, actually, because, again, I pride myself on belonging to neither party. But if I want to vote in a primary, I will switch temporarily. So it's kind of messy the way it works. I wish Connecticut would just open the primaries. It seems, again, that that would give people the most voice and the most power. And it would take a bit of the power away from the Democratic and Republican parties, but that's not the rules that Connecticut has set up. Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir. Here, let's. Thank you.
Why do you think some primaries are closed throughout states and some are open? Is there a specific reason for that, or do you believe it's just like that for the sake of it being
Well,
like that?
there is always a specific reason, but what those reasons are is a product of a long tradition and history that speaks to each state's differences. So one of the reasons behind having a closed primary is because the parties are so entrenched in power in their respective states. The Democrats don't want you to be an independent, neither do the Republicans. And so in order to force you to become a Democrat or a Republican, they'll create rules that say you can only vote if you belong to that party. And they hope, I bet, that you won't switch back to being an independent if they're partially closed like Connecticut. Those that are entirely closed, meaning you can't switch back and forth, it's even worse. That's where the parties are even more entrenched. But it dates back to the history of the country's founding in terms of how that all worked. Now, you might know, related to that, this country's history, if you had a kind of graph of how democracy works, far fewer people participated way back when in the primaries. Basically, committees decided who would get to be their nominee. Now it's the people who decide it in an ever increasing number of people get to vote in these primaries. So even despite these rules, democracy has opened up to people. And I like to say one of the biggest ironies of how this works, the more that people have had rights opened up to them, the less people are interested in voting. That's one of the ironies of American government, but it is the case. So that's a good question. You'd have to do a lot of research into each state, though, in terms of who the actors were, who the participants were in making it the way they did. Any other questions or comments?
So I'm sure you're aware that a couple states across the country, like specifically for Democratic parties, they actually canceled their primaries, effectively making Joe Biden like the winner of those states. What's your thoughts on that?
I don't think anything should be canceled. I think that democracy should prevail. And, I take issue with the way both parties do what they do, especially in terms of sometimes it even seems like they change the rules on the spot when it's convenient for them. One of the things that was a hang-up in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was running for the Democratic Party was that, I won't write it on the board, but within the Democratic Party, there are two types of delegates, just to be a bit more specific. There are delegates and there are superdelegates. Right? Superdelegates are made up of the elite members with the most money within the Democratic Party. And all of them supported Hillary Clinton. Right? But the delegates supported Bernie Sanders. And many delegates supported eventually Barack Obama, who ended up winning. But those superdelegates have a disproportionate amount of power within the Democratic Party. So those kinds of things, those are very anti-democratic to me. For me, democracy is when average, ordinary citizens are empowered. When you have superdelegates made up of the elite having a disproportionate amount of power, it doesn't tend to work. And it's those same kinds of elite that make those rules, that cancel primaries because, oh, Joe Biden is just going to win. That kind of thing I would disagree with. Any other questions or comments? I had a feeling that there would be a comment from the peanut gallery.
I always have comments.
Of course you do.
So can you talk a little bit about historically how young people have voted or they haven't? And what are your thoughts about getting more young people to vote? Do you have any ideas on that?
So the first part of the question is how historically people have voted in primaries, you mean, or just broadly? Well, the way the primaries were set up, first of all, you had to be at some point 21 in order to vote in a lot of states, and only recently was it reduced to 18 over the last generation and a half or so. So that's one thing. Secondly, now there are movements throughout many parts of the country to get 16 and 17-year-olds to vote. Maine just passed a law that gives 16-year-olds the right to vote in local elections. California has tried the same, although I don't think it succeeded. Now, if you're only 17, but you are 18 by the time November comes around, you can now vote in primaries in some states, not all states. So you can see how just diverse the history of these things are. But we have moved from, just to answer your question a little more fully and to go back to a point I made earlier, it used to be that only white adult property-owning men could vote, as many of you may know. In the 1840s, it was opened up to white men who didn't own property. So women still could not vote. African Americans could not vote. In 1870, those property restrictions were completely eliminated, and African Americans got the right to vote, at least on paper. As you might know, the southern states found ways around that. And really, African Americans have not been able to vote fully until 1964. Right? Women got the right to vote in 1920. 18-year-olds got the right to vote in 1972. And now 16 and 17-year-olds. So I think this is answering your question. So the vote has been broadened to include a lot more people. I don't see why 16 and 17-year-olds shouldn't be allowed to vote. The question is, are they educated enough? Well, I know a lot of people who are 40 and not educated enough to vote. So I don't think age is the requirement for that, right? And there are other sort of arbitrary restrictions as well. Certainly there has to be a cutoff with age. You can't have a 9-year-old voting, I guess. But 16, 17, you've been through enough to know, and you have the critical thinking skills to be able to make those decisions. But I think that answers your question. Yeah, it's been broadened significantly.
So I have a quick question regarding the recent primary in Michigan. There was a sizable amount of the vote to uncommitted,
Yes.
directly related to a specific issue, namely the war in Gaza. Recent Gallup polls also show shifting support among not only the American populace as a whole from 68 to 58% support of Israel. Now, under the 18 to 34 range, it's dropped more than 35%.
Right.
Right. So significant shifts in ideas and approaches to some of these very critical foreign policy issues. What kind of effect do you think this will have on Joe Biden during the general election, assuming they both make it to that place?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I'm aware of what's happening in Michigan. And for those of you who don't know, so Michigan has a very large Arab population, Arab American population, and many of those Arabs and Arab Americans are dissatisfied with Joe Biden's foreign policy regarding the situation in Gaza, its support of Israel, and its decision to kind of allow the leader of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, to bomb and indiscriminately, affect the Gazan people to the point where there is some starvation happening. And a lot of Americans have taken Joe Biden to task on that. Not that the Republicans pose any good alternative to that, but that is why a lot of those voters in Michigan decided to vote uncommitted rather than go to the Republican side. Now, what are the consequences? They're huge. They're huge. Here's why. Michigan is one of those very important swing states. You cannot be president of the United States. You cannot be elected if you don't win a combination of Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. It's almost impossible to do it. You'd have to basically run the table. And so if those uncommitted decide that Joe Biden is not worth voting for against Donald Trump, that could inadvertently swing the contest in favor of Trump in 2024. That's how significant, number one, foreign policy is. That's how important the situation in Gaza is to a lot of Americans. And that is how much it can impact a national election, a presidential election. So I think you would all do well to get informed on what's happening in Michigan. That's really interesting, number one, but also it has a whole bunch of significance. Yep. Eric.
Thank you, Dr. Fierro. So with the current crisis in the border and all these illegal immigrants crossing and, from all different countries around the world, do you think this will have a big impact on this year's elections? And will there be a bias in a certain administration considering they are allowing this to happen?
Okay, so the question, I don't know if you all heard, it is about the immigrants who are crossing the border from Mexico, from many, many parts of the world. There's a record number of what are called, in some circles, illegal crossings. Others prefer to call it undocumented people. Regardless, those are just kind of semantics, I think. But according to polls, immigration, especially the border immigration, is the most important issue next to the economy for the American people. So to the extent that Joe Biden is lagging in the polls, I think that has a lot to do with it. It's not just his age or his mental acuity. It's the fact that a lot of Americans perceive immigration across the border to be a problem, especially when Republicans and others have made a lot about who the people coming across are. They're young men, they're dangerous, many of them could be terrorists. That's the kind of narrative you hear, and that is hitting Biden pretty hard. I think he's struggling with that. The country does not have an immigration policy. I think it should. I think it should develop a comprehensive one. It takes the president to take the lead on that. I don't think Biden has exercised good leadership. Congress should take the lead on that, too. It has not exercised good leadership. Members of both parties, I think, are completely irresponsible when it comes to immigration. And so it's an unfortunate incident, but it doesn't typically in presidential elections rank as high as it is this time around. It's number 1 or 2. The economy is number 1 or 2 when it comes to the issues that voters most care about. You have a backup question, follow-up question?
I also forgot to add, considering a lot you hear online, especially in both parties talking about this, do you think that illegal immigrants are, will they have the ability to vote even though they are undocumented, and the effect on the election in 2024?
I don't think that would, first of all, there is an effort on the part of some cities and some states to allow those who don't have proper papers to vote. That's true. But I do think the effect will be negligible. In other words, not at all. I don't think it will change the outcome of a presidential election. That's not to say it's not wrong that citizenship should mean something. You should have citizenship in order to vote. That's what I believe. That's what the Constitution mandates. But I don't think that the numbers will support the idea that, the voting of those who are not documented is going to swing the election either way. I really don't. I don't think there's evidence for that, at least. I know that is the fear on the part of some, but I don't think it'll sway the election. I think what will is the degree to which registered voters vote. And on either side, if voters stay home the way they may in Michigan, that could tilt the election. If voters stay home in Florida, which is a kind of a swing state, leaning red, leaning Republican, that will tilt the election. When voters become apathetic and indifferent, that's what changes the outcome of an election, more than what happens around the edges. And I do think that's a peripheral issue.
Okay. So I know that the polls are showing that right now Donald Trump has the biggest lead Republicans had in 20 years over Joe Biden. But I just wanted to look at the numbers. Recently, as you may know, Missouri voted. And in 2016, when Trump was at his height of taking over the Republican Party, he got over 300,000 votes. In Michigan, only 900 people voted in their primary.
In the Republican primary?
Yes. So 900 people voted. He got actually 100% of the votes. Not one person voted for Nikki Haley, but
in Michigan, but only 900 people.
In Missouri.
Oh,
in Missouri.
Oh, you said Michigan.
Missouri.
Okay.
So he got 300,000 votes plus another 300,000 votes for Ted Cruz. So my understanding is the enthusiasm still there? And
as it was in 2016.
As it was, and I know we're saying he's beating Nikki Haley by 20 points, but that's still 40% of the Republican Party that is not voting for Donald Trump.
Agreed, and that's an excellent point. So you can look at that two ways. You can look at it the way Trump does and say, well, Nikki Haley is not winning any delegates; she has no chance. The way Nikki Haley is looking at it, I'm getting 40% of the vote in a lot of these states, and that means something. And so while he did get a large number of delegates in 2016, he's not faring as well now. You're absolutely right about that. And what does that mean? I think the Republicans are hoping and believe that once Nikki Haley finally does drop out, that everybody else will rally toward Trump.
And you saw those polls probably that were people in the moment saying, I won't vote for Donald Trump if
no matter what.
Or 43% of her voters said, I'm not voting for him if he's convicted of a crime.
That is true as well. I've seen those polls. I would kind of dispute the assertion that he's ahead of Biden by a record amount. The polls indicate he's ahead by 4 or 5 points nationally, but he's pulling away, it seems, in the swing states.
Yeah.
Which is more it's more of an indicator of who wins, the swing states, not the national vote. That doesn't matter. The interesting thing is if Nikki Haley were to be the Republican nomination, she trounces Biden by about 20 points. And yet she's not going to be the nominee. So it's a good question. And I think it's an accurate description of where we are with the Republican Party. Matthew has another question.
Thank you. One of the things that I like to start off my international relations course with is...
Oh, by the way, Matthew teaches international relations, just in case you don't know, so you should take his course.
I appreciate that. One of the things I like...
You got an applause. You haven't even spoken yet. What's going on here?
An international relations student.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Go ahead. Go ahead with your question.
One of the things I like to start off my class with is that we as Americans have a particular duty because our nation exerts the most amount of force in foreign affairs. Mm-hmm. So it's our duty to be more informed than other citizens of other nations.
That's a good point.
So I did want to just circle back to the immigration topic. I think that a lot of Americans they're unaware of the history of American involvement in South America over the past 50 years, which...
I'm sorry, American what?
American involvement.
Involvement,
yeah. Over the past 50 years and quite frankly longer in some of these nations in South America, right, which have significantly affected the internal security and political dynamics, which lead to these people seeking refuge, right, and coming to the United States. So one of the things that Dr. Fierro says is we all need to get involved. We need to vote in local, state, federal, primary elections. But we have to be educated voters. We have to make sure that we look at the history because there are reasons why people are coming here today. The United States has supported, tens of coups through the CIA, which have led to military dictatorships in some of these nations, inadvertently caused famine in some of them, right? Our own VP of DEI is a refugee from Guatemala, right? Because of United States involvement in that nation. So we have a duty as Americans, and we need to make sure that we are educated, also voting, but educated while voting.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, great point. I think that the history of immigration, I studied that at UConn in the doctoral program, is a very complicated and nuanced one. And I think Matthew raises very good points that part of what's happening there is a product of the long history of America's involvement in those areas. Some would call it imperialism, indirect imperialism. It wasn't outright colonization for the most part, but it did have quite an impact culturally, right? I do think at the same time that, to me, that's the macro side of it. But the micro side of it is more short term. And there's a reason why there's an influx, a record number now, which has less to do with American foreign policy and more to do with the politics that we see in America now being played by both parties, that they actually, maybe unintentionally, but they encourage immigration from these parts of the world because they can score political points with it. And I don't think either party is immune. I think they've behaved horribly bad, and I think you'd agree with me on this, irresponsibly when it comes to immigration. This country needs a comprehensive immigration policy that can mitigate some of the effects of imperialism. And it has not done that. And when I say it has behaved irresponsibly, I don't mean just Joe Biden. And I don't mean just Donald Trump. They had very different policies, and those policies do matter, by the way, the differences. But I mean members of Congress are just, the issue is so demagogued, it's not even funny. And I think there's a reason it's the number one issue that American voters are facing today, because it's in such a state of misery, this whole, policy or lack of policy that the United States has. We're allowing people who are poor, who are being taken advantage of at the border, we're allowing them in and not keeping a record of how they're coming in or why they're coming in. And you're right. I think to look at some of the root causes of that would go a long way in developing a comprehensive immigration policy, absolutely. But anyway, it's really unfortunate the way both sides have played up this issue. Any other questions? Okay, well, we've gone more than an hour. That was my goal today. Thank you all for being here. Before you go, I was thinking if we can scrounge up $100 to have an essay contest that students, not faculty, but those students who participate and who attend, write an essay of their choice related to any four of the events We'll put it in a pile, and we'll have a group of faculty members judge these essays, and the winner gets, I don't know, a $100 gift certificate. We can't give you money. That's why I say gift certificate. What do you think of that? Who would participate if I did that? Nobody? Okay, thank you. $100 or $100. Okay, so
500 and I'm in.
500. Good Lord. You know, it used to be that $20 would convince students. Now it's 500.
Inflation.
Inflation, you're right. So anyway, keep that in the back of your mind. If we decide to do that, and I'll talk to some of my colleagues about that, then we will advertise it along with the events themselves. Anyway, thank you for coming. I appreciate it. And Mike, thank you for videotaping last minute. And Kelly, thank you for helping to organize.